What do we mean when we describe the study of politics as a kind of science? Prior to the standardization of academic disciplines in the early 20th century, politics was studied as an element of history, which in turn provided the raw material for philosophical reflection on the idea of government. The idea that there is a science of politics is relatively new, though thinkers as far back as Aristotle have contributed to this concept. We study politics as a science by gathering, sorting, and interpreting the data of political events. From this mass of evidence, patterns and structures are discerned, developmental patterns are traced, and out of the chaotic flux of experience comes generalized theories about humans succeed or fail to live together. Scientific inquiry of any sort is concerned with taxonomies, that is to say, the labeling and classification of one's subjects. Depending on their interests, political scientists study voters, or protesters, or political entrepreneurs, or the working class, or the economic elite, or any other group that can be distinguished from the great mass of ordinary people. Because political scientists are usually interested in more dramatic protagonists, the charismatic politician, the committed activists, and so on, the ordinary people of society tend to fade into the background, to serve as the raw material upon which external political forces act. As Nancy Bermeo uses the phrase, ordinary people refers to the great majority of society who live entirely private lives. These lives revolve around the pursuit of a living or a calling, a focus on family and neighborhood, and all the myriad pursuits of life that do not necessarily involve the need to act politically. Political theory going back to Aristotle has made a fundamental distinction between the public life and private life. Politics is the activity appropriate to the public sphere, and ancient and medieval thinkers took for granted the idea that public life should not intrude into private life, just as private life should not intrude into public life. Indeed, this assumption survived into the modern era, as liberalism's ideological insistence that private economic life should not be subjected to political manipulation, while politics should not be subjected to the private desires of a few elites. But historical experience repeatedly demonstrated the fact that public and private life is inextricable, and that the conditions of one help shape the conditions of the other. In the 17th and 18th centuries, periods we associate with the rise to power of the European bourgeoisie of capitalist producers and professionals, what was once thought of as the realm of private life distinct from politics was reimagined as the concept of civil society. As a concept, civil society seeks to distinguish those organizations and activities of social life that, though they may appear similar, are basically different from political activities. From churches to universities to labor unions to theater troupes to birdwatching clubs, civil society is the manifestation of people's interests and desires, how they collectively pursue their vision of the good life. In this view, society is a densely interwoven network of associations. Associations are like cells that, assembled together, make up the body of society. Just like cells, these associations can be hyper-specialized and display a wide variety of forms even while sharing the same underlying structures. This framework of civil society is distinct from older concepts of the private sphere, chiefly in terms of organization. Civil society is the visible form of private life. Within associations, participants enjoy private pursuits, but they do so as part of an organization with a hierarchy and a goal. For example, students pursue knowledge and training in colleges under the supervision of professors and governed by elaborate codes of conduct. Religious sects spread their message through more or less organized networks of activists and office holders, whether they are called bishops or imams or rabbis or lamas. Even actors staging a play must, in the end, take the lead of a director. Seen from this perspective, life in civil society appears to be, in many cases, the whole of life. In a robust civil society, politics can seem a distant and alien practice. Nevertheless, the very concept of civil society points to its inescapable relationship with politics. Most importantly, the complexity of civil society requires a state capable of enforcing the rules needed for that civil society to function smoothly. At the very least, a so-called night watchman state is unavoidable, since at a minimum there must be an authority capable of enforcing contracts and punishing violence within society. In general, civil society implies the need for a state that can reliably uphold the conditions that make private associational life possible. The political science literature has a curious relationship with the concept of civil society. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a great vogue for civil society. On the one hand, the peaceful revolutions that brought down the USSR were seen as a triumph of long repressed civil societies that drew on powerful inner resources to defeat a totalitarian state. On the other hand, the political and economic chaos of the post-Soviet countries was blamed on a weak, poorly developed civil society that could not provide the resources necessary to sustain democracy. This view took for granted the idea that robust civil societies and democracies existed in a kind of virtuous codependence. Dense civil societies were schools for democracy that taught the habits of good citizenship, and their strength served as a counterweight to aggressive states. The health of one guaranteed the health of the other. So a vibrant civil society came to be seen as a promising seedbed for democracy, while supposedly weak civil societies were blamed for democratic failure and backsliding. But another major trend in the literature holds that rather than strengthening democracy, robust civil societies are a danger to democracy. This view assumes that a society full of diverse and active associations is a mobilized society, in which a significant portion of the population is actively engaged in shaping social life. This kind of mobilization naturally drifts toward the political, since there is an obvious link between the balance of powers in a civil society and a state that governs that society. A strong democracy has the institutional capacity to absorb and channel this mobilized energy. The demands made by different groups can be addressed, different interests can be balanced against one another, and the losing side of a given conflict can be reconciled within the system. But underdeveloped or weakened democracies lack this capacity. And it may be the case that some associations or coalitions are strong enough to defy the state. At the very least, a robust civil society can overload an unprepared system, leading to political gridlock and voter alienation. What matters most for our purposes is that civil society is where most ordinary people live. And so to understand what role ordinary people play in politics, we need to look at the points of intersection between civil society and the state. Since we are concerned with democratic breakdown, we will focus on the concept of polarization as it affects relations between state and society. Polarization refers to the sorting of political parties and voters toward ideological or electoral extremes. In minimally polarized societies, voters tend to congregate in the political center. Parties capable of building large coalitions and pursuing moderate, non-confrontational agendas tend to be rewarded. Polarization increases as voters drift away from broad centrist parties and group themselves into more ideologically cohesive parties that advance more partisan agendas. Consider the many transformations of the American party system, especially the shift that began in the 1950s. As the National Democratic Party embraced civil rights, alienated white Southerners began to defect to the Republican Party, which embraced opposition to civil rights as a way of winning over these ex-Democratic voters and gaining electoral ground in the South. After about 1965, mostly conservative white Democrats were replaced by mostly liberal black Democrats. Meanwhile, the conservative takeover of the Republican Party put pressure on the party's liberal wing in New England and the Midwest, which was driven to extinction between 1960 and 2000. As like-minded voters sorted themselves into the two parties, each became more ideologically focused and concentrated on pleasing its most committed voters. The Republican Party's embrace of a hard right agenda after 1980 accelerated polarization. As conservatives flocked to the Republican banner, liberals held fast to the Democratic Party, and each party tried to win over a large enough slice of the independent electorate to win a majority. A belated leftward shift in the Democratic Party again accelerated the polarizing trend. One can still find Democrats who describe themselves as conservative, but hardly any Republican would describe themselves as a liberal or a progressive. All democracies go through cycles of increased and decreased polarization. The danger of democratic breakdown comes when polarization is high, because polarization necessarily weakens the forces of the political center and increases the power of extreme parties that are not committed to preserving the system as it exists. Bermeo directs our attention to two kinds of polarization. Private polarization is expressed in voting patterns and public opinion. Individual citizens cast votes or give opinions that express their particular views. Public polarization is expressed through mass mobilization and confrontation, in which citizens of similar views act collectively to pursue their goals. Most importantly, Bermeo insists we distinguish between elite polarization and mass polarization. The relationship between the two is fraught. Elite polarization refers to divisions within the ruling class. The inability of American senators to conduct public business, or of the British Parliament to conclude the Brexit fiasco, reflects bitter polarization among the tiny elite that is invested with direct political power. Mass polarization expresses divisions among the population at large, as captured by election results and mass mobilization campaigns. Both forms of polarization are intertwined, but Bermeo insists that it is mistaken to blame historical cases of democratic breakdown on mass polarization. It is not the great mass of ordinary citizens who abandon democracy. Rather, it is the elites that do so, and uncontrolled elite polarization is what poses the most dire threat to democracy. In 1920, 26 of 28 European states were parliamentary democracies. Most were new democracies, created along with new nation-states carved from the empires that died in the First World War. By 1938, 13 of those democracies had broken down into one or another kind of authoritarian regime. This period provided the first historical model for democratic breakdown. The consensus view, solidified in the aftermath of the Second World War, blamed the peoples of Europe for the failure of the mass democratic experiment that began in 1918. In this view, democracy was fatally undermined by popular recklessness. Millions of Europeans became acquainted with democracy in the context of post-war revolutions and economic chaos. These new citizens, unfamiliar with democratic practices and lacking democratic habits, made impossible, incompatible demands of the representative governments that simply could not satisfy all of their constituents. Disillusioned, the masses abandoned moderate parties of the political center for extremes on the left and right, which mobilized disaffected voters to use democracy's own tools against it. However, it should be noted that in all of these cases, the victorious extremists were on the right, and the fascist solutions they imposed always began with the violent suppression of the left. The European experience seemed to suggest that democracy was failed by the very people it sought to empower. Indeed, strong civil societies were a serious liability, since they had the organizational power to press their demands and make trouble if the state spurned them. Bermeo's goal is to push back against this argument, and prove that the data and assumptions the argument relies on are flawed, or at least misinterpreted. The chief misinterpretation of the European interwar period, for Bermeo, is to take for granted the fascist claims that their dictatorships were created with the support of the great majority of the population. Fascism is one of the most remarkable developments in 20th century politics, a right-wing mutation that combined ultranationalism, anti-socialism, and pseudo-democratic spectacle into violent, unstable regimes. Because fascism was most successful in Italy and Germany, these unique cases are often taken to be descriptive of all anti-democratic movements in interwar Europe. Both of these regimes were deeply invested in winning popular support, or at least in mounting spectacles that gave the impression of popular support. Fascist propaganda was enormously successful in this regard, and it deeply influenced the first generation of post-war scholars, whose studies of the collapse of democracy in Italy and Germany focused on the role of ordinary people in bolstering the fortunes of fascist movements. But the data does not bear this out. Bermeo finds in most European cases the decisive factor in undermining democracy was the defection of elites. It was elites, the people on the commanding heights of law, business, the military, the nobility, and so on, who abandoned democracy and threw their support to extremist parties first. In fact, most average voters retained a stubborn commitment to mainstream Democratic parties, continuing to vote for them in large numbers, even as attention was directed to extremist movements willing to use violence to seize power. One symptom of democratic decay in Europe was a series of rapid-fire elections, signaling chronic government instability and weakness. From Portugal to Italy to Germany to Romania, a pattern emerged in which elite defection weakened centrist parties, despite the fact that those parties retained their mass voter base. Because elites tend to focus on the opinion of fellow elites rather than the mass of ordinary citizens, high-level polarization moved rapidly as elites reoriented around extremist parties. This in turn affected the decisions of sitting governments. The fascist claim that their rise to power depended on mass support is undermined by the fact that fascist movements were often invited to join existing governments before they ever succeeded in winning elections. Mussolini was invited to join the liberal Italian government in 1921 when he was no more than a gang leader. German conservatives invited Hitler into their councils, convinced they could manipulate it. In both cases, the existing elites were co-opted and neutralized to make way for dictatorship. What was held up by fascists to be mass popular support was in fact a reflection of caution, fear, and passivity. Ordinary people continued to vote for democracy up until the point it was no longer possible to vote for anything. Rather than violently resist this seizure of power, most people looked away from the political persecution and violence that accompanied the death of democracy. Not until the Second World War would fascism encounter armed resistance, and even then it took a 6-year war of unparalleled destruction to defeat it. Bermeo's discussions of later Latin American cases are all worthwhile, but I want to briefly focus on the case of Chile. On October 25, 2020, Chilean voters overwhelmingly chose to rewrite the existing constitution. This vote came after more than a year of sustained protests in the country, which began as protests against bus fare hikes and exploded into a mass movement calling for wholesale social reform. The movement regularly engaged in violent clashes with the police, but the ultimate result was a resounding electoral victory for the protesters. Chile's current constitution has been in effect since 1990, when the dictator Augusto Pinochet stepped down from power in what was then celebrated as a victory for democracy. But Pinochet left power as part of a negotiated transfer of authority, which restored some democratic institutions alongside other institutions made permanent under the dictatorship. Hence, Chile's constitution makes it impossible to pass laws that alter the power of the military, or heavily regulate business, or make it easier to vote. Should any such laws be passed, a Supreme Court is empowered to strike them down. So though technically a democracy, Chile has lived under a dictator's constitution for 2 generations. All of that changed on Sunday. But how did the dictatorship come to be in the first place? Until its violent destruction by a military coup in 1973, Chile's democracy was the oldest and most stable in Latin America. In 1970, Salvador Allende was elected president. Allende was a socialist, and as president, he relied on the strength of his Popular Unity coalition in Congress to govern. But Popular Unity could not command a congressional majority, and Allende met stiff resistance as he pursued his mandate to begin socializing key industries. Allende was an avowed Marxist, a fact which provoked tremendous fear among the middle and upper classes in Chile. Allende's opponents, who normally could not agree on anything, united in fear of a supposed communist takeover. A capital strike began, in which wealthy Chileans moved their money out of the country to cripple the economy and force the socialists out of government. Strikes, protests, and lockouts swept the country as elites polarized into hardcore pro- or anti-Allende positions. In the context of economic crisis and widespread unrest, elections served to mobilize the population even further. Congressional elections became referenda on Allende and the Popular Unity agenda, but no party was able to win a decisive majority. Nevertheless, voters did not abandon the parties of the political center. Popular Unity was a democratic socialist movement that was committed to working within the existing political system. Anti-democratic fringes of the left and the right gained no electoral support even as conditions in Chile continued to deteriorate. Instead, elites fearful of Allende abandoned the democratic process as unreliable and opened negotiations with military officers hostile to the government. Crucially, these elites seemed to truly believe that Allende, as frustrated as they were by political deadlock, was readying a socialist coup d'etat of his own. Thus, the conspiracy to overthrow Chilean democracy acted on a genuine but incorrect belief that it was acting against another conspiracy. This was plainly not the case. When tanks took to the streets and planes bombed the presidential palace on September 11, 1973, there was no armed response from the left. They too were caught unprepared for the coup. Allende died in his office, whether he either shot himself or was murdered by the military. Thousands of socialist activists were disappeared and tortured, and hundreds more murdered. Many were drugged and thrown from helicopters into the Atlantic Ocean. General Augusto Pinochet ruled as dictator of the country for 17 years. The regime was never popular, but a mix of repression and economic growth kept the country stable until 1990, when a protest movement too big to be beaten back by police prompted Pinochet to step down. But the constitution that was his legacy remained to govern Chile in his absence. The constitution was written with no popular input, designed by the architects of the coup to make the democratic socialist experiment of the early 1970s an impossibility. Now, for the first time in decades, there is a chance for the Chilean people to restore genuine democracy.